Cross-border payments. And our moderator for today is Camilla Bullock. So Camilla Bullock is the CEO of Emerging Payments Association Asia. So I'll hand it over to her, but in the meantime, let's give a round of applause.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Intersekt, for having me moderating this panel on one of my and Emerging Payments Association Asia's favorite topics. We have some of the most innovative payments providers in our membership, and we represent them on a global arena talking about enhancing cross-border payments, specifically under the G20 project that focuses on lower cost, increased speed, transparency and access in cross-border payments and what that can mean for prosperity in the world. And I have a star-studded panel here with me today. So I have Andy White, CEO of AusPaynet. I have Samarth Bansal, GM at Wise Platform, based in Singapore normally. I have Vinod Manoharan, Vice President and Country Head for ANZ, for NEOM. And I have Crystal Richens, APAC Payments Innovation Products Director for JP Morgan. I'm not going to introduce the organizations because if you haven't heard about those organizations, you might be in the wrong room or look them up in the app. But we just have 30 minutes, and that's probably the biggest challenge. So I'm just going to set the stage a little bit so we don't dive into things you already know. But does anybody in the audience know the monumental event that happened in real-time instant payments, cross-border, 2018? I know that you're all thinking about the first linkage between Thailand and Singapore. That was the first time where the individuals actually can do a real-time cross-border payment just using their phone number. And this means so much in our regions that has so much remittance, especially in Southeast Asia. And this got everybody started to thinking. And in the same time, the Financial Stability Board and the G20 looked into what would it mean in the world if we actually enhance cross-border payments. So a lot of thinking camps was put on across our region, thinking there are over 70 real-time payments instant networks. They're doing domestically low-cost payments. So what could it be if we start to link those together? In 2021, it was an MOU signed between Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand, and those linkages between those networks started to happen. But if you're looking at Malaysia, for example, that has most linkages in the world, they have 7. Every linkage they've told takes about 3 years. And if we're going to link up 20 networks together, that's 190 linkages. So this will take a lot of man-hours. So central banks, this is how I think it happened, were complaining and thinking, how should we do this? It's a great opportunity. So they went to their bank of banks, to the Bank of International Settlement, and said, can we do something? They said to their innovation hub, the BIS Innovation Hub in Singapore, do you have an idea? And they said, yes, we have. Let's call it Nexus. You might have heard about Nexus. So that is a hub that they have put a blueprint on and now going to take to, they've done the proof of concept, so it's going live, but it won't happen overnight. And that is like a hub bespoke model. So when you connect in, you can do your real-time payments with other participants in that hub. Andy, how is Australia positioned in this story? And are those linkages important for us?
Thanks Camilla, and thanks everyone. So I think the interesting groundbreaking thing in Australia is the introduction of the International Payment Service by AP+. If you think about how international payments used to work coming into Australia, the real-time gross settlement system, which was vital to those payments, shuts off at 10 o'clock on a Friday. Doesn't sound too bad, at least it's sort of 10 o'clock at night. However, obviously that's early afternoon in Europe, it's early morning in the US, and if payments coming from those jurisdictions don't hit RTGS before 10 o'clock at night, you wait until Monday. So that's pretty slow. So when you think about the G20 ambition on speed, that's where the International Payment Service leveraging NPP can really help with that. That said, and this isn't a criticism of that arrangement or, for example, SEPA, we might talk about SEPA later, those arrangements are known as one-leg-out arrangements or OLOs for a reason. They're only trying to solve the last leg, the last mile of that payment. They're not trying to solve the end-to-end issue here. So if you're serious about speed and indeed transparency and access and cost, that's where linkages become quite attractive. And as you kind of hinted at, the issue there is that, to be sort of Orwellian, some linkages were born better than others. Bilateral linkages don't stand up to the test, really, because of that point about how long it takes to create them and the fact that, effectively you start all over again when you create the next one. That's a real issue with bilateral linkages. So, the RBA did a fantastic report on looking at interlinkages for Australia, published in April this year, if you haven't seen it, which concluded that Australia's strong preference across the ecosystem would be for multilateral linkages. So think Nexus, because there you have an opportunity to have commonality. You can have a common rule book for the way these things work. You can use next generation payment infrastructure, which is really attractive. You can move beyond OLOs, one-leg outs, because you can make participation mandatory rather than optional, and so on. And also, you can do inbound and outbound, whereas, for example, IPS, the International Payment Service, is only inbound. So moving to those multilateral linkages, theoretically quite attractive. However, that report also acknowledged that even those multilateral linkages aren't without challenge. You've got to agree that common rule book and that common set of standards. You've got to agree some governance arrangements, which Nexus has done, and the commercials that go with all of that, and message standards, et cetera. So, preference towards multilateral linkages, but no step forward really from Australia's perspective yet. And so where does that leave us? Well, to your question, it means that linkages aren't necessarily critical. What could be quite interesting to think about there is the opportunity for harmonisation of arrangements. So without linkage, if we can harmonise ISO 2082, which we're leading some work on between domestic payments and international payments, then that's an opportunity. And the other part would be innovation. So without linkages, how can people innovate in cross-border payments? And I'm sure my fellow panellists will have some things to say about that.
An interesting piece there is also with the bilateral linkages, we will see them happen in the heavy trade corridor, so people might be left behind. But turning to you, Vinod, because this with linking domestic networks, you already do that in 200 markets, I think.
Yeah, correct. So from NEEM's perspective, it took us 10 years to build what we have today, where we can basically pay anyone around the world. If it's taking a commercial player 10 years, you can imagine how long it's going to take. Was it 20 governments to align on something like this? So that's probably the main thing. The role that we're playing is that we are enabling these real-time payment use cases today for banks and fintechs around the world. And we are not making it normal. We're raising expectations in the public, and I think that's actually a good thing for us. It's going to, also put pressure on governments to hurry up a little. But to your point, we are already doing this today. That's the main thing I wanted to cover today.
So what is the most important use case in Australia, you would say?
Supplier payments for SMEs. The one thing when you work in remittances, the one thing you know is that there's never a good time to delay anyone's remittance. And when it does go missing, the lack of visibility is very painful. And this is where the traditional rails, you don't get that. If you're leveraging local clearing systems in the send and receive country, you do get that. And we can provide that to our clients, which it could be a bank, it could be a fintech. But visibility of payment, visibility of the cost of payment, these are all the critical things that customers look for.
Excellent, thank you for that. So Miles, turning to you with an APAC role, we heard the drivers in the G20 project, but what are the drivers on the ground and how do they compare across the regions?
Firstly, very excited to be here. I'm flying in from hot, humid Singapore, so I'm going to be shivering through a lot of the answers that I'm going to be speaking about. But I think the intent that we're seeing over the last few years with whether that's Project Nexus, the G20, is all waking up to customer expectations, those customers being retail consumers like you and I, SMEs, who are demanding low value transfers being instant, be transparent, and low cost, right? Like that's the expectation that is helping drive governments recognizing the need for this. I think a lot of the panelists tend to romanticize the concept of just the infrastructure. of saying that the be-all and end-all is going to be connecting the linkages. To Vinod's point, getting access to the RTP rails and connecting them is just one part of the problem you're solving for. You need to stitch all of this together to give that end-to-end experience to customers. And just to bring home this point, we do about 80 checks per second for every transaction that goes from country A to country B. We have visibility on 800 plus liquidity accounts around the world. We're predicting how much we'll require for doing payouts, let's say in INR on 30th of March, and then working backwards to know what our liquidity cost should be and how we hedge that. A lot of this is not solved through the linkages, right? Like for a long period of time, the SWIFT correspondent rails have been built on RTGS. That'll continue happening. The challenge is how do you stitch all of this together to give that end-to-end payment experience that consumers, businesses around the world want. So at least in APAC, what we are seeing is the moment you continue making this mandate, and we've seen this with IPS in Australia, banks have struggled to keep up with the pace of the deadlines that we put in place, right? They're having to juggle so many priorities on upgrading domestic payment schemes, on having to figure out international payments, how do you be IPS compliant, where they don't have the time for innovation, right? Like they're having to just catch up on keeping the domestic payment rails running and humming and meeting the expectations that their consumers have. And that's where platforms like us, where we've spent the last 13 years building and just very clearly focusing on building efficiency on low-value transactions around the world, come in. We help get the part of the infrastructure, get the part of the customer experience, get the part of tracking, all to these platforms around the world. So the on-the-ground problem is how do you solve for the customer experience, not necessarily the linkages between the connections.
Yeah, no, and we don't really want to understand how it's done, especially I think at SMEs. They don't have time to think around it. But Crystal, do you agree what they're saying so far, specifically here about banks not keeping on top of innovations?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because as a consumer, I may have used some of these provider solutions for transfers for my own personal use. And I would agree that it has been, like you could call it a disruptor, it has encouraged competition in the industry, which is a good thing. From my perspective, I look more from the wholesale perspective, not so much on the retail side, to be honest. From the wholesale side of banking, thinking about solutions, one of our roles is to connect into payment systems directly and to provide solutions to remittance providers, whether they be other banks or whether they be FinTechs or other money movement providers in the industry. In doing that, our role is to try and remove some of those overheads associated with like due diligence and the costs of connectivity and those changes that you're exposed to and the risks that go along with that as well. So I think when we think about how the changes are moving along, there's definite room for continual partnership in the industry. I think we're going to see definite evolution in the space. This is just the beginning of something. Nexus provides a strong opportunity for us and for all banks, I would say, who have particularly regional global providers who have a strong footprint of connecting directly with domestic clearings. Because we, instead of having to, for example, solution for international payments in Australia and solution for OLO in the EU, if we could go to one single connection point, that would reduce a significant amount of overheads for us, which then drives down the cost of payments, which then passes down eventually to the consumer. So it's a positive initiative and one that we're invested in helping to develop and guide as well.
We talked a bit about this on the prep session. I love prep sessions, by the way. You get so much intel on it, and we talked about partnerships and how it drives down the cost, and how it's a little bit like the app in the apps in an iPhone or any other phone that you don't know how to use them before you've seen it, and it's those new business model coming alive. So I want to hear from Vinod and then Samath. Can you speak and give some example of bank partnership and what new models you brought out?
Yeah, sure. So, we power cross-border payments for a lot of banks around the world, across all regions. Probably a recent one I'd probably call out is we did a deal with Emirates NBD, who have an existing remittance product, but are now leveraging NEM's payment infrastructure to access real-time payouts for their sort of migrant community within the Middle Eastern region. Emirates NBD is literally one of the biggest banking groups in the region, and with a relatively fast integration are able to activate much better capability than would have been made possible otherwise. So that's the one I'd probably call out.
Thank you, Samath.
So we have about 85 financial institutions around the world that use us as their correspondent, both for payouts as well as for collections. Very interestingly, we worked with, maybe I'll call out 3 examples, right? One is Standard Chartered's digital bank in Hong Kong. They had the ability to use Standard Chartered's correspondent banking and decided to work with Wise just because they were so clear on the customer experience elements of this that they wanted to try and get, the coverage, the speed, the low cost, the transparency, but also that delight that comes with having sent money from a customer to your recipient and having that money reach them in 3 seconds. We got screenshots from the CPO sending us, hey, this is incredible. Like, imagine sending money from Hong Kong to a recipient in Brazil and the money hitting them in 3 seconds, right? So that's one. The other is a traditional bank that decided to augment their retail consumer payout experience by working with us. We saved about $2.3 million for their consumers by just bringing down the cost of remittance in the first year that they went live. But the fun fact there is, doing a remittance through this bank that's powered by Wise platform is faster than that consumer doing a remittance on Wise. So 66% of transactions through this bank were instant. And that today for Wise stands at 62%. So we're actually bringing more value to the entire ecosystem by embedding ourselves and offering this to banks and partners. The third, I think we touched a little bit about the supply chain, the SME payment space. So we work with one of the largest SME banks in France, and they use us for both their collections as well as their payouts. So we offer them local IBANs across multiple markets to receive invoice payments from their suppliers, but also to do account payables. So those are broadly the kind of partnerships that we are seeing a lot of value in and growth in. One of the innovations, which was a learning from having tried to solve for 85 banks, and I think Vinod here will attest to that as well, it's incredibly difficult for banks to integrate with APIs still today, right? And so one of the things that we recognized was it's just so much easier for them to continue using Swift messaging, right? Like their entire operations from the front to the back to how do they do RFIs and respond to questions that come up are all based on Swift. That's just a messaging format. We took that message and we ingested it into our system to still give you the access to Wise platform or the Wise infrastructure, but you don't have to do any integrations. All you do is send us a Swift message. We take care of the rest of it.
I don't know, I think it was 2022, we did a whole series of alternative rails, but we actually renamed it and we called it a complementary rails down the line because it's that, I said it 3 times today already, horses for courses. I don't know what that's my favorite saying, but there is different opportunities with different rails. But Australia could arguably be said to have more similarities with Europe than Southeast Asia. So going to turn to you, Crystal, for some experience from Europe and where we had the SEPA, the Single European Payments Area, that came into play last year. And it had some unintended consequences, that the implementation cost was very high and it was patchy uptake, and it sort of favored the banks instead of increasing competitions. What do you think we could learn in Australia from the SEPA implementation?
Yeah, I think one of the learnings from the instant payment mandate is proportionality. And proportionality, we often think about sort of big versus small, but you need to think about segments as well. So you need to think about broker-dealers versus fintechs versus e-com, for example, versus wholesale banking versus retail banking. When proportionality isn't considered, because retail is the consumer-facing element, often that's the most focal part from a regulatory perspective, then they tend to be very retail-centric in their outcomes that are desired. And as a result, it can, and I think one of the challenges in Europe is that it's actually having an impact on competition because some of the smaller providers are being etched out of the market because they can't keep up with the pace of regulatory change. For example, if you're a member of the ACH system, you now have to be a member of the instant payment system. There are some provider types who simply have no use case for that, but now have to go to the overhead and expense of connecting to the instant payment system. Not only does that increase their risk profile to their company and their costs, but just generally it means they have to maintain a platform that won't be used. So I think that's one of the challenges that we've seen. I think from an Australian perspective and just APAC in general, we want to really push the message of proportionality when anything's being moved forward, because the last thing, I would want to see personally is that we would etch out some of the smaller providers that would really impact competition and innovation in the market.
I think this is a really important question here, so I'm actually going to get everybody to comment on it. So, Samas, do you want to go next? I saw that you...
Yeah, sure. So I think I have a slightly different take on this, and just bear with me, right? So banks have built their entire business model on lending, and for some reason we think that domestic payments is also now the purview of just banks, right? That has to change at some point, right? Domestic payments isn't necessarily always equal to lending, and so a lot of markets still stage gate the access to instant payment schemes to a banking license. So I think what Crystal's trying to say is that we should be giving access to instant payment schemes as long as the use cases, the providers that are tapping into it can show a demonstrated business model, a need for getting access to that, but also are very cognizant of the risk and compliances that come with getting participation in this. It shouldn't be just limited to banking licenses. I think that's the point that we've seen, and having done these direct connections now in 5 markets and a few more to instant payment schemes, I think governments are waking up to this, regulators are waking up to this to say payments are no longer just the domain for banks. Banks have a very important role to play there, but how do we open up competition in the space?
I think that ties in with the FSB's agenda, though, around accessibility in general. We look at it in its simplistic terms of being able to access a market or a currency, but it's not. It's multiple providers being able to access a payment system. There'll always be challenges around the actual settlement account at a central bank, but the payment system itself, I think generally we're seeing them open up globally now.
I agree with both of you, but it is that same risk, same activity, same licensing. But I think in the last consultation paper that went in the G20 was this, but can we define the risk then? Because it's sort of sometimes that certain players are more risky without we actually backing that with data points. But that can go in both directions, I think. I think we just have to work towards a level playing field and also not over-regulating. So, Vinod, to see what you have for view on this question.
No, look, I'd echo everything that's been said. Look, we obviously have a similar business model to Wise. We are obviously direct competitors. So, we are looking at infrastructure in that same way as well. If we don't have to be a bank, that's great. But at the same time, I do think when you're regulated as a bank, Australia, for example, super conservative. Corporate Australia is super conservative. I don't just mean banks, I mean even sort of large MNCs. And I think they like the idea that I'm dealing with someone who's going through the same hoops as me. So it's something to leverage, at least in this sort of conservative market. But sometimes it's overly onerous because, those sort of the restrictions placed on someone like that, it's not, I wouldn't say it's so relevant to a remittance player, but we'll have to jump through those hoops just to prove that we have, the right safeguards in place.
It's tricky because once trust goes, it's gone, and we're all in this together. Whenever we lose trust, our industry is falling apart. But Andy, you are more or less the industry. Do you want to comment on this one also?
Yeah, I do. I kind of violently agree with everything that we've heard so far. I think that's the opportunity in the licensing regime that is coming in Australia. It is deliberately tiered. It is same risk, same rules, but it's identifying the function or activity that you do in the ecosystem and then applying the suitable regulation to that activity. It's not expecting if you're not a bank to be regulated the same way as a bank, but if you're providing some of those same functions, then the regulation should be similar. So I think that's a real hope. We just need to get that regulation in to the point that was made earlier. The current regulation dates back to the 1990s, and it made some good assumptions that were valid then, but they're no longer valid now.
Staying a little bit on risk also, not a panel without a fraud question, I think. And we are making headway in preparing and mitigating risk in Australia, and you're also involved in this work. Are we ready for increased volume, real-time payments cross-border? And if not, what do we need to do now?
So the danger with fraud and scam questions is it becomes doom and gloom very quickly. I'm going to try and be really positive here, actually, and say that I think the opportunity here is to learn from what we've done in real-time payments domestically. So a lot of that is hinged on the data that I talked about earlier, you know, the fact that we have richer data, and we've gone from 18 characters to 14,000 fields in moving to ISO 2082. And so you can use that for things like real-time risk monitoring, AML, KYC, sanction screening. We've also made real steps in terms of confirmation of payee. And again, you can see that potential in cross-border payments in using, you know, trusted name, trusted address, legal entity identifiers, those sorts of things. And also in terms of risk-based friction that we've added to real-time payments. So I think if we can apply those learnings from domestic payments to cross-border, we're in a pretty good place. And thinking about linkages, the focus of this panel, the key thing there is to build those into the scheme rules for the linkages. So it's a consistent set of regulation on those really important economic crime matters across that whole life cycle of that cross-border payment.
I often say, I think, you know, innovation that you didn't know you could live without, or how this goes, when it comes. And I think that pre-validation of payments, isn't it crazy that we pay people without knowing that they are the right person on the other end? I think in a few years down the line, we're just going to say, how could we have done that before? But I think you all want one good advice to know how you're going to position yourself in this evolving story around the cross-border instant payments. So they all going to get one advice to you, audience. Chris, should I start with you?
Sure. I think you need to get involved and get engaged with the initiatives, not just at a local level, but at a global level as well. So if you're representing a global company or even a regional company, get involved with whatever FSB G20 initiative group is running in your industry forums. That is the number one piece of advice. The more we can influence how we evolve as a market, the more progressive we'll be.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, look, my advice is don't necessarily wait for this enormous project to complete before you think about taking advantage of the benefits. You can take advantage of it today. But obviously, please check us out at neem.com. But there, not just us, our peers as well. We're all bringing innovation to this space, and that's my point. I don't think people realise you can do cross-border payments in real time pretty much around the world, like right now. And you do not need to wait. I mean, I was, having a conversation with one of my colleagues who's travelled offshore. They couldn't believe that we don't, for local Victorians, we don't have a train from the airport to the city, and we all know what's happened. There's been twists and turns, and this is a project with a clear communal benefit. Domestic to Victoria, and it's taken this long. How do we think 20 countries are going to go with this, which I would argue is a much more complex project? So my point is don't wait, check us, players like us out, and yeah, away you go. Thank you.
Do I have to limit myself to one? Okay. So I think for me, the core is just keep demanding more of whoever your payment partner is, right? Like the expectation you have is the right expectation. Ask them to make payments faster, ask them to make them cheaper, and help them solve your use case, because that's what's helping drive a lot of the innovation that we're seeing in this space today, right? Like that's what governments, regulators are waking up to and saying, okay, fine, this is what consumers are asking us to do. This is where we need to be at. So that's number one. And second, if you feel partners aren't moving quickly enough, change your partner.
So you started with Nexus, I'm going to finish with Nexus. I'm going to say watch the next phase of Nexus. It's moving from theory to practice in phase 4. There's an actual scheme operator, which is super exciting, and probably even more exciting is the link to UPI in India, the largest, fastest payment system on earth, which has its whole own ecosystem around innovation. So watch that, it's going to be fascinating.
I'm going to say one also if I dare, and then we have a... Is it a question? Yes, if it's a short question, a short answer.
UPI in India, great, thanks India. Why in Thailand cannot work like in India with UPI?
So if I'm getting that question, UPI has just moved to Thailand. It's still running on prompt pay, which is not the same standard as UPI. Will it get there? 100%.
Yeah, but why the tourists cannot pay with PromptPay in Thailand? You arriving, you can't use PromptPay QR codes. In India, I went, you just pay everywhere. So beautiful in India, right? You come to Thailand, you are hungry because cash cards are not accepted, you know. Why is that? Sorry. Okay,
We'll solve it another time. My advice to all...
I didn't get an answer. You've got experts, but anyway, thanks.
to all is to don't be afraid of somebody's eating your pie, because the pie is growing constantly. So if everybody's focused on what we're really good at and find the partners around it, because trade is, yes, growing constantly, and there is no trade without payments. Thank you very much to my panel. Thank you, Intersekt.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.